Welcome to ANT1 TLC. This is presentation 12. It's a subject overview, all about our subject on anthropology and care. So the basic idea behind TLC is that care might be partly natural, but it's mostly cultural and social. So anthropology, which is the study of society and culture, provides great insight into care. And in week 12, we consider an article that summarized some of the themes from the subject. In particular, its name is Book Anthropology of Aging and Care. Book focuses on aging, but we're interested in the care part of the article. In particular, the concepts we've looked at in this subject: kinship, reciprocity, more than human, embodiment, gender, violence, governmentality, neoliberalism, and self-care. So these themes come up in the article, which make it a perfect lens to review the subject as a whole. So this review article can provide us with a revision of transforming lives through care as a subject. But what is a review article? It's an article where they ask a leading scholar in the field to sum up the state of play. So unlike other articles we've read in this subject, this is not based on Buch's own ethnography. It doesn't have a single contention or main argument or whatever you want to call it. Instead, it provides an overview on current theories, debates, case studies, and so on in the anthropology of care. So let's use this as a lens to provide an overview for transforming lives through care. In week 1, we were looking at defining anthropology and defining care. So as I explained, what we're doing at La Trobe is socio-cultural anthropology. That's the study of the cultural and social elements of human life. Obviously, care has natural biological elements. We are humans, and along with other mammals, our babies suckle. But what anthropologists are interested in is the cultural elements, not the natural elements of care. So even if we think about breastfeeding, I explained in the seminar about milk parents amongst the Cocos Malays. It's not the mother who gave birth, but the neighbor or friend who wants to make an attachment or bond with a child, and their family who asks to become, if they can breastfeed the child. Alternatively, you probably heard about during the Victorian period, the middle to late 1800s in England, and to a certain extent in Australia too. But in England, wet nurses were commonly used by upper class women who did not want to breastfeed their children, so they passed it along to often lower class women who had just given birth and were lactating. So what we're looking at in this subject is not the natural and biological elements, but rather the cultural and social elements of care. The other thing we need to define is care itself. And let's start with week 1, where the theme was what is care and what is anthropology. We'll start with care. As Book points out, this is an English language word, and it has two meanings. One is an affective concern. If I say I care about the Richmond Tigers Football Club, that means I have an emotional concern about the Richmond Tigers. And the other is practical action, which is caring for. If I say I care for my grandmother, it means that I actually take actions to make her life better in some ways. Often this duality of meaning contributes to beliefs that caring actions are best or most naturally motivated by caring feelings. In other words, because of this kind of dual meaning, we kind of conflate the two meanings. When somebody is caring for another person, we assume they're caring about. But, Book asks, does this moral understanding of the relationship between feeling and action extend to non-English speakers? We've seen one problem with it, and that was in the Thai case, where Orlinho describes how there's very little deep affective concern going on when Bunyuang's taking care of her mother. So it leads us to a problem. Is care only an emic concept? I mean, can it do the etic work we need from it in non-English and non-European contexts? Can we apply this concept care accurately to describe what Bunyuang's doing. If we assume that care has to have an affective concern, that is, a caring about an emotional investment, perhaps what Bunyuang's doing is not care. And perhaps the word care carries too much specific cultural freight to move across context. That is, we can't use it as an etic concept, potentially. That said, if we are going to use it, we can see that it's both a resource and a relational practice. It works across scales of social life, in the connections and fissures between global political economic transformations and the most intimate aspects of daily life. So when she says it's a resource is something like caring for a nurse cares for a patient by giving the patient medicine or helping the patient soften their pillow. On the other hand, it's also a relational practice, which means that a relationship between the nurse and the patient is thereby established. We've seen all kinds of relational elements to care. It came through in your minor essays when you were talking about your relationships with family members. It came through in the reading about Salvadoran migrants and their relationships with their parents back in El Salvador. In fact, in most of the readings, we had a sense of relational practice. In some senses, the problems that we saw in the care for the Inuit population in trying to wipe out TB was that the relational practice was ignored or upended. The relationships between the Inuits themselves were undermined or ignored for a new kind of relationship, which is a direct relationship of care from the state. So when we say it's a resource, it's an action, as in habitually changing nappies, and it's also a thing, like a remittance. And care is shaped by relationships. For example, we've looked at the avuncular relationship, or the father-son relationship, or the relationships between state and indigenous persons. So that's what we mean by resource and relational practice. So if we're talking about relationships, all human societies have relationships that anthropologists call kinship relationships. That is, family relationships. And the theme in week 2 is that caring and these family relationships are closely interconnected. As Book says, the study of kinship may be productively reoriented from concerns about marriage, sexuality, and gender. We could add here consanguinity, affinity, etc., toward a concern for the actual situations in which people experience the need to care and be cared for, and to the political economies of their distribution. So what we discovered in week 2 is who cares for whom is structured by kinship rules. For example, mother's brother, daughter-in-law, these kinds of things. Mother's brother in the societies that Levi-Strauss was looking at. Daughter-in-law we covered in Taiwan later in the subject. And the idea is that kinship shapes care. So kinship determines who cares for whom. Or perhaps care, more than consanguinity, affinity, gender, sexuality, marriage, creates kinship. That care might be the primary factor in kinship. Either way, there's a political economy in the distribution. That is, typically mothers or whoever in a given society takes a mother role does more of it. And this certainly came through in your minor essays. Most of you reflected on the roles of your mother. Some also reflected on the roles of the father too. As a father, I'm happy to see that. But yes, most related to the role of the mother. From there, we went to the idea of the gift in week 3. And you might remember the theme was care and reciprocity. As Book says, care is another way of talking about social reproduction, the work in reproducing and sustaining both biological and social life over time and across generations. So this is something that actually goes a bit further than what we were looking at in the subject. If we look at, for example, a wife caring for her husband and kids, from a Maussian sense, we can see understanding this as the gift. The gift of care that a mother gives for her children will presumably be through principles of reciprocity, return when the mother ages. Similarly, the care that a wife provides for the husband will hopefully be reciprocated in other ways. So, care is an obligation that sustains life and societies. Like gifts, exchange, hold relationships together. So, exchange gifts make and maintain relationships. Similarly, care sustains life and society. But what's interesting is if we go a step further and say, well, in a capitalist society, this care also supports capitalism. So the care that a wife provides for her husband and kids is a form of unpaid labour that maintains the capitalist system. And we're talking more about the 60s and 70s here, where women were not part of the workforce, but as you know, women do have to leave the workforce typically once they have children. It's a typical pattern, and this also takes a form of unpaid labour. So this brings us to the next point from Book's article, which also highlights a major theme in the subject. People negotiate the social significance of interdependence through daily care practices, highlighting the interconnectedness of moral and political economies. So if we take the first point, which care shows how lives are independent, this came through clearly in your minor essays where you described how patterns of care within your family brought you together, and brought you together not as a bunch of independent, autonomous individuals, but as a family. So caring and family were closely linked in your essays. And this is part of what we could call a moral economy, which is the intimate webs of obligation and reciprocity and interdependence. In other words, the gift economy of your family. Now, for anthropologists, as I mentioned, this economy is just as important as what you study in an economics major. And what you study in the economics major is typically related to what anthropologists call a political economy, which is the broader systems of the state, the market, and neoliberal reforms shaping who gives and receives care. So this is kind of like when we're talking about the carescape, how states such as the Philippines and Taiwan interact, and there's a market for caregiving, and how that relates to neoliberal reforms. And in that context, we saw how daily practices link moral economy, like of a little Taiwanese household, with a larger political economy when they bring in a Filipina to be a surrogate daughter-in-law. And we can also extend this to more than human care. For example, pigs in Vanuatu and goats in India, pets in your household, people and animals together negotiate social significance. So this is really more at the moral economy level, but of the gift exchange of your family. But social significance is negotiated, and we create, for example, our little gerbil to be a member of the family. And this moves us along to the next theme in our subject, which is embodiment, under the topic heading Embodied Care, Care and Our Body. So the quote from Book is that changing care arrangements thus highlight the intersections of embodied experience, everyday practice, intergenerational relations, and political economy. So the first point here is that care is not just ideas, it's embodied in routines and bodily acts. So in the words of de Ruyter and de Klerk, practices of care are not just social, but are also bodily encounters. So small or big gestures like feeding, bathing, lifting are bodily. In fact, as All in You shows, Thai caregivers practice an embodied form of care. It's not really an idea of caring or even an ideal of caring, but a practiced first and foremost, which they can barely explain. And it's a similar thing when Jackson writes about fathers caring for disabled children. He does write about how their ideals of masculinity are changed, but on other points, Jackson, when he's describing tickling his son's belly, Dakota's belly, it's primarily a gesture, a bodily interaction. That's the form that care takes. And that brings us, of course, over to the ideas of masculinity and gender and care. So the week 6 idea or theme is really associated with gender. And being male, I didn't really feel qualified to discuss women's experience, but hopefully our discussion of a man's experience, that is Jackson's experience, and the experience of those husbands and fathers looking after their cognitively disabled sons, can give us some insights to the gender dimensions. Discussions of care and aging sometimes tend towards Orientalism and nostalgia for places and times before modernity, globalization, and capitalism, when families cared for their elders. And this is I think I've slipped into at times when I'm teaching, and sometimes in your essays I saw you slipping into this kind of Orientalism and nostalgia. Yet many of these care arrangements depended on forms of gender socialization and coercion because, in previous eras as now, women were disproportionately recruited to care for elders through their roles as wives, daughters-in-law, and domestic servants. So the point here is that women, especially wives and daughters and domestic workers, have long carried and still carry disproportionate care burdens. And we see this later in the subject when we talk about Filipino and Indonesian migrant women facing sexism, racism, and exploitation as surrogate daughters-in-law. But despite that, also displaying some ways to act in accordance with their own will, in a sense that we call agency. In other words, they can also demonstrate agency. But our particular focus was fathers challenging masculinity by embracing caregiving. And this is, again, the fathers of cognitively disabled children struggling to become carers, initially at least, because they're running up against notions of masculinity that they were not enculturated into. Week 7, we were looking at what is called the carescape, and particularly themes of structure and agency. The simple point is that migrant women from poor countries also play a key role in elder care in many wealthy nations. So global inequalities shape who provides care. For example, we saw that people migrate from El Salvador to the USA, and some of them end up in caring roles because of a global inequality. El Salvador is a relatively poor country, whereas the USA is a relatively rich country. So migrant women often leave their own families to care for strangers abroad. And some of you were asking me, like, what happens to the families that are left behind, the children left behind? And that's an interesting topic too that people doing research in this field look at. I mean, often it's, for example, the grandparents, particularly the grandmother, who has to care for the grandchildren. So their roles that they play are racialized. So, for example, the Taiwanese see the Filipinas as a kind of a servile race, gendered. In other words, they're women, and also precarious. They can be sent back on a whim. And this is part of the stuff. This context is what we call the carescape when we're talking about international rules, laws, visas, local employment laws, the actual agency they work for, or the people the household they work in, and also the room for agency in relation to this carescape, how they can, for example, act in their own way, for example, by cuddling the grandmother or the grandfather and saying, I love you. And I think if I'm saying I love you, I'm focusing, and it's been a problem in this subject, that we've focused too much on the touchy, feel-good, nice aspects of care without dealing enough with the difficult elements. I mean, part of it is the things we're talking about: global inequalities, precariousness of care work. But I don't think we've done that enough. But hopefully in week 8 with coercive care, healing in violent spaces, we got to explore the complexity and difficulty of this. Book says that care can be seen as a moral practice, but also holds the potential to generate hierarchy and difference, and of course we would say violence. We looked at the case of drug treatment centers in Mexico that are really for the poorest of the poor in Mexico, that even the rich people in Mexico look down on. And in these places we know care is violent. It involves coercion and harm. But this violence is framed as being necessary for healing. And of course, we're talking about the anexos here. But in more generally, as in the problems that we're describing, is that care can reinforce hierarchies instead of dissolving them. And these are the ideas of gender, women being better carers, or dark-skinned people being more naturally, or Asian women being more caring. These kinds of racial ideas of care can actually reinforce hierarchies instead of dissolving them. And these are, I would say, the harder aspects of care to stomach, and they're the ones that we should have focused on more in the subject. Having said that, it does come through a lot in weeks 9 and 10, the difficulties associated with care, and one of them is governmentality, which is care as control. The way Book explains it is regimes of care can have perverse consequences when they harness forms of compassion that imagine apolitical suffering subjects as separate from broader socio-political circumstances. By individualizing, anonymizing, and medicalizing responses to human suffering, these forms of care can foreclose structural or collective responses to injustice. What she's referring to here is what Foucault describes as governmentality, a form of care that involves managing populations. It appears apolitical as being simply compassionate, but it also allows control. So Foucault talks about how welfare and health programs discipline and regulate subjects. And the example we looked at was from Stevenson, who considered Inuit TB evacuations in the 1950s and 60s, which were framed as benevolent and helpful and saving the Inuit, but were also deeply colonial as they resulted in attempts to make the population less nomadic, to make it more controllable by the state. And also when we're talking about the socio-political circumstances, takes them away from their kin and puts them in an institution. Done with the best intentions, people who really white settlers who sincerely cared for Inuit and cared for the Inuit, but at the same time their form of caring actually reinforced the colonial structures. In week 10 we looked at neoliberal care, which is the next step after governmental care, which is a new form of governmentality in a way, which is about self-reliance rather than welfare. As Book explains, in European and North American contexts, neoliberal healthcare policies have increased support for paid home care programs, thereby reconfiguring the meanings of home and care as sustaining personhood against the threats of social death signaled by institutionalization. So the point is that if you got a neoliberal economist and he looked at what happened to the Inuit, he would be opposed to that too. He would say, hey, this cost the state a lot of money. It didn't give the Inuit any choice over what they about their own health provision. Why don't we let the Inuits choose their own health provision? This will make it cheaper for the state and give them more freedom to choose. So it seems like a kind of good idea. So it seems like a good idea to deal with the problems of governmentality. De Ruyt and de Klerk describe Dutch reforms moved care from state institutions to home and family. And in the seminar, we looked at the NDIS, which was, the idea was if you are like severely disabled, rather than putting you in an institution and spending a lot of money giving you things you might not want, why don't you figure out what you want for yourself? We'll give you the same kind of money or a little bit less, and you can figure out what works for you. It'll be cheaper for us and better for you. The flip side of that is that care can become precarious, uneven, and commodified. It stops being a kind of right. Like you can't just rock up and say, look, I've been severely disabled in a car crash. Now look after me. Instead, the government says, okay, you've been severely disabled. Now what do you want? How can we help you? Which sounds kind of okay, but the problem is that the responsibility, it's no longer a right that you can just say, take care of me. It's the government says, no, you take care of yourself. We'll help fund it, but you take care of yourself. And the problem, according to the critics, is that care becomes precarious, uneven, and commodified, and people slip through the gaps. Which leads us to the final substantive topic, which is self-care, survival, resistance, and radical refusal. To quote Book, amid neoliberal restructurings of governments that have retracted public health and welfare programs, a number of scholars describe how local practices of care among kin and neighbours work to morally and practically recuperate social relations. So what she means is that in the face of neoliberal reform, kin, neighbours, and other local groups revive and repair social relations amongst themselves. And we looked at how, in the gaps left by neoliberalism, people improvise new practices of care. And Hobart and Neist described self-care, sort of individualized, looking after myself, but also what they see as more radical, which is collective care. And when for example, the Black Panthers set up kitchens to provide for urban African Americans, or on the Dakota Pipeline, resistance and demonstrations, how people banded together to provide care for the demonstrators. So this brings us to the conclusion of the subject. The main point is that care is partly biological indeed, but mostly learned. These learned aspects are basically culture and society, the cultural and social aspects of care. And this is what anthropology focuses on, culture and society. And our concepts can illuminate these learned aspects of care. To do that, we've moved from intimate levels of care, like kinship in the family and with pets, to global levels of governmentality and neoliberalism, and finally returned to intimate levels of self-care, individual and radical care, community-based care. So for anthropology, the significance is that care can be analysed in terms of kinship. Primarily, in the first instance, care seems to be family-based. In terms of the gift, there are reciprocal arrangements involved in caring. More than human relations. Animals such as pets or pigs in Vanuatu or goats in Uttarakhand are associated with this care reciprocity too, and they're part of the family. Embodiment. Care is not just, or maybe not even, ideas and ideals, but actual bodily practice. Gender. In most cases, women provide care. Care is associated with women, and in many ways that is not acknowledged, particularly in patriarchal structures. Structure and agency. The lives of migrant care workers from the Philippines and from Indonesia working in Taiwan and Japan are structured by such things as visa requirements, international arrangements between governments, local labour laws, employer practices, and the ability for these migrant workers to demonstrate some forms of agency, to act within these structures in ways that reflects their own motivations. Violence. We often think of care in a kind of feel-good, nice way, but in fact, in violent contexts, like in Mexico, in the drug world of Mexico, violence is also seen as a form of care. Governmentality. When states take over care, they tend to treat people as part of a population that can be, a person can be anonymized, can be reduced to a basic form of life that can be cared for, whose life can be extended and enriched. But at the same time, this allows for a great deal of control over their lives and removes care from its context of the family. Neoliberalism, which was seen as a way to address the excesses, the financial excesses of the welfare state, and allow for a greater individuality in care provision. So to reduce the cost of welfare and to provide individuals with more choice over their own care, neoliberal reforms put the onus back on the individual to care for themselves, with government funding, of course. And self-care, which is the individual or community taking care of themselves, which can, in some ways just enable the neoliberal system, but in other ways could be seen as a form of resistance or even radical refusal of the neoliberal system. So each of these concepts also provides us with a different sense of person. What kind of person? Like myself as a father, I'm different from myself as a member of the Australian population, as an Australian citizen. There are different roles there. As a receiver of gifts from my family, it's different from, for example, the very limited pastoral care I'm supposed to provide as a lecturer, which I'm paid for. So there are different elements in each of these concepts which show different elements of who we are and really reflects on who we are as humans if you can think about it deeply enough. So hopefully this course has started you along that process. So the significance for care, for our understanding of caring relations, is that the way we have arranged care in our culture, and other cultures arrange care in their cultures, is not natural or biological. It is created in culturally specific ways. And that means it could be recreated in new and different ways. Options are available. It's not set in stone. So there's the significance for our understanding of care. That brings you pretty much to the end of the subject. So what's next? Well, the first thing you can do is enroll in anthropology subjects. They're running over the summer semester and they begin in semester 1 next year too. And I strongly encourage you to take this step because for me, anthropology has been one of the most eye-opening things I've ever undertaken in my life. I mean, I can act as I mentioned, a father, a son, a citizen, a lecturer, all kinds of things, a baseball coach, all the things I've done in my life. And anthropology has provided me with a kind of alter life, an alter ego, which looks at this life with fascination and excitement and looks at other worlds and the people live in with that same excitement. And you've taken that first step, but believe me, as you get deeper and deeper into these concepts, the more illuminating and exciting they become. And I strongly encourage you to take that path because I found it extremely rewarding for myself. And I think you'll find it rewarding for yourself too.